Hello, welcome to Thor Talk, the show all about Marvel's resident God of Thunder. About 3 years ago, Donny Cates was announced as the new writer of the Thor series, and I was excited. I made a video calling him perfect for the series. Now that we're 28 issues in, I'm going to give my thoughts on his run so far. Was I wrong about Donny Cates being perfect for the series? Is he worthy of the Thunder? Or is he struggling to lift the hammer? Find out my thoughts on Thor Talk.
I am Thor the Thunderer, son of Odin, prince of Asgard, and this world is under my protection.
There's a lot to cover, so we'll go story by story, starting with the Devourer King, which takes place in Thor number 1 to number 6. So this is an odd one for me, with some interesting highs and lows. The initial concept it teased was interesting, with this universe-eating equivalent to Galactus known as the Black Winter being the major threat. Galactus has made Thor his herald with the hopes of keeping him under his control. Thor, meanwhile, is attempting to live up to the role of King of Asgard, so he refuses to show any submission. The King and the Devourer are constantly battling each other for control, but they recognize that they still need each other. This creates an interesting dynamic, which is a highlight of the story, but is also part of one of its major problems: poor power scaling. Thor absolutely bullies Galactus, and at the same time gets hurt by Beta Ray Bill and even a rock thrown by a random alien. On top of that, there isn't even a really good explanation for why Thor can so thoroughly humiliate Galactus. This is supposedly one of the most powerful versions of Galactus ever, and this Thor has only a portion of the Odin Force and a portion of the Power Cosmic. That's an impressive combination for Thor, but it shouldn't add up to him being so vastly more powerful than the most powerful version of Galactus. It may shock some of you to know that I am actually a bit of a Thor fan. I know, a huge surprise, but it's true. As a Thor fan, I like seeing Thor do powerful and cool things, but when he becomes so ridiculously powerful without a logical explanation, I think it actually takes away from his accomplishments. Remember when Black Panther managed to overpower Silver Surfer? Well, maybe you don't, because it was so illogical that everyone ignored it as nonsense. None of the power scaling here reaches that level, but some of it is a bit of a stretch. I mean, Thor can usually give Galactus some problems, and Odin can usually contend with Galactus, but again, this is a more powerful version of Galactus, and this is Thor having way too easy a time with him. On the other hand, Cates provided plenty of other things that I love seeing as a Thor fan, such as the God Blast and a cool feat where Thor fights for 2 years straight. Cates also provides some interesting characterization for Thor, with him acting like a bit of a jerk, but specifically because he's trying to live up to being a king like Odin. Still, this story also felt a bit rushed after the first few issues. Thor and Galactus are slowly collecting planets, and suddenly get all of them in the span of a few panels. Then they encounter the Black Winter, and as interesting as the Black Winter seemed, it ultimately was rather underwhelming, with it being pretty easily taken out. While it is apparently not permanently destroyed, this story was set up as being Cates' God Butcher saga, but ultimately it just seems like setup for another story which might be his God Butcher saga. Speaking of which, Thanos being set up as the big final villain for Thor is a bit of an odd choice since he's not really a Thor villain. On the other hand, though, Thor does have a better claim on him than most individual heroes, and it's possible that Cates can make him a true Thor villain with this story. After all, Namor and Black Panther were able to become arch-enemies within the span of a few years, and now Namor is the villain of Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. The next 2 issues are basically filler, but they were also 2 of my favorites. Thor sends Mjolnir down to Broxton, Oklahoma to see if the enchantment on Mjolnir is really broken, and a man named Adam picks it up. First of all, the coolest part of this was that the phone number for Tony Stark that Thor wrote on Mjolnir actually worked. It's no longer online, but originally when you called it, Tony Stark would leave an annoyed message and say that he now has a new number.
Yes, this is Iron Man. However, due to some big blonde jerk, I no longer use this number. But hey, nice try anyway. For all things Tony Stark, please visit www.tonystarkironman.com and try and stay safe out there, yeah? I'm busy enough as it is.
That's just such a cool little detail that they really didn't have to do, and I love it. This story also does a great job of characterizing Tony Stark and Thor. It puts them in conflict without it feeling too contrived. Tony is right to be concerned that Mjolnir could have fallen into enemy hands, and while Thor had the situation well in hand, Tony had no way of knowing that. Thor recognizes this, and he does his best to be patient, but eventually he just has to put his foot down, in a clear homage to Thor Volume 3, Number 3, which is one of my favorite issues, so that was also great. I also love the scene where Thor teaches Adam how to fly. To me, it just exudes joy. Issue 8 was one of my favorites, but unfortunately the next storyline I didn't enjoy quite as much. The Prey storyline has Donald Blake returning as a tortured villain. It's not the worst idea, with Blake being an important part of Thor's history and not really having a place for years. It has a strong enough start, but never quite reaches the heights that I was hoping for. Even though it does have to mess with continuity to happen, Blake's backstory is compelling enough. He was created as an afterthought, forced to feel pain, and then forgotten about. Despite this, Donald Blake's role as a villain isn't very well done. He's presented as being this big, unstoppable threat who easily defeats Loki, murders Red Norvell, and overwhelms all of Asgard. Then, in the middle of the story, he's defeated by Throg and Lockjaw, which completely destroys all the buildup of him being a big threat. Donald Blake's plan is also a bit generic, with him just wanting to get revenge on Odin by hurting people important to him. It's not a bad villain plan, but it's also not a particularly interesting one. Thor is also left on the sidelines for most of this story. Blake is presented as being Thor's shadow who was forgotten by Thor, but he doesn't really seem to care about Thor. In fact, Thor is barely in this story at all. Red Norvell's death was also really poorly handled. He's killed off-screen by Blake, and this is done to make him seem even scarier, but honestly it just ended up being forgettable. In fact, when Blake is imprisoned by Loki for his crimes, I was very confused why he deserved such a brutal punishment when he didn't even kill anyone, and it was only when I went back and reread it that I realized that he killed Red Norvell. So the death was so forgettable that I literally forgot about it. Now, don't get me wrong, this story isn't all bad by any means. Blake sparing Jane because she cared about him and not Thor was a great moment. Especially the part where, after Jane tells him that she's now been demoted to working in a morgue, he leaves by saying, "Jane, you don't belong in the morgue," which has double meaning because he's both saying, "Jane, you deserve better than working in a morgue," and he's saying that he's not going to put her in a morgue by killing her. That's good writing, I liked that. It was also great to see Odin immediately come to help when he realized it was his fault and that Thor needed him. Thor showing up in the Destroyer armor was very cool. Thor putting down his foot and defying Odin's desire to kill Blake was also great, because Thor has been struggling with Odin's shadow in being king, so it was great to see him fully cement himself in that role by defying Odin and showing that he was now the king of Asgard. That was good. Next came the prelude to the God of Hammer storyline, and this was an odd mix. Thor decides that Mjolnir is acting off because Thor is king now, which would make sense if not for the fact that he's been king before and it wasn't an issue. I did like the issue where Thor leaves the hammer with the Avengers. Thor shows up during a fight to talk to Captain America and doesn't even seem to notice the army of robot monsters around him, but when he does notice them, he immediately takes them out with one lightning blast. Thor opens up to Captain America about how relieved he is to see that the Avengers are alive, since as a god he perceives time differently. I liked this moment, because in the past we've seen Thor leave for a century and return to Earth to find that everyone he'd known has died out, so it makes sense that he'd be worried about this happening to the Avengers. He perceives time differently, so he might end up coming back and not realizing he's been gone for centuries. So it's a legitimate concern for him. Thor gets a good moment with Freya, and we get to see Freya's battle cat, which is a reference to her cat-drawn chariot from Norse mythology, and I do love that reference. We also got some oddities in this issue, which I didn't really like. Freya dubs herself the god of the hunt, and explicitly rejects being called the goddess of the hunt, which doesn't really make any sense. It's like if Natalie Portman won Best Actress for her role in Thor Love and Thunder, and rejected it not because it was a bad performance in a very bad movie, but because she wanted to run for Best Actor instead. It's a weird distinction to make that doesn't really make any sense. Another odd moment is Angela saying that as Odin's firstborn, she can walk into Asgard and claim the throne anytime she wants because it's rightfully hers. But this also doesn't make any sense. While it is often tradition to have the firstborn ascend to the throne, Odin specifically abdicated the throne to Thor. Next, we have the oddest issue by far in the series, Thor number 18. It features Thor going to Throg for help in tracking down his missing hammer. In this issue, Throg is presented as being this sneaky and well-informed spy character, and honestly, I don't mind it. With Thor and Beta Ray Bill existing, Throg needs a role of his own in order to stand out, and being a spy works for a little frog. However, this issue is the greatest example of one of my biggest problems with Cates' run so far: setup. The entire issue is about Throg assembling a team to track down Mjolnir, but this team is never seen again in the story. The only payoff to this issue is that when Sif, the all-seeing goddess, informs Thor that Broxton, Oklahoma has been destroyed by Mjolnir, Throg is with her, even though she probably could have seen that for herself. Now, do I think that Cates wasted Thor number 18? No, I don't. I think what he did was prioritize setup for a future story over the current story. I think that's an issue that has kind of held this run back. The ending to the Black Winter story felt rushed, but it's okay because the Black Winter will show up again. The ending to Blake's story felt unsatisfactory, but it set him up to appear later. Cates definitely has some big grand plan for his Thor run, and I think that sometimes he's a bit too focused on that plan. He's content to set it up as opposed to focus on the story itself, because as long as that piece is there for later, then he's done his job and can move on to the next thing. This may all result in some grand payoff where every element comes together perfectly, but right now I feel that it leaves the current stories feeling kind of unremarkable. They're not bad, and there are some definite high points, but they feel like there's something missing. Anyway, the God of Hammers storyline begins after this, and it was here that I had lost faith in the idea that Cates was perfect for Thor. Thor goes in search of the mystic God of Hammers, which is wreaking havoc with Mjolnir, and this leads to another minor problem I have with Cates' run, which is weightless deaths. I briefly mentioned how Red Norvell's death was poorly handled in Blake's Reign of Terror. However, the worst offender by far comes in the next issue, where Mjolnir apparently kills the entire population of Broxton, Oklahoma. Broxton, Oklahoma, the quiet little town that the Asgardians called home for years, the town where Bill and Kelda fell in love, the town that stood against Galactus, the town that the gods of Asgard bowed to, is completely annihilated off-panel. It feels unnecessary and purely done for shock value. Soon, the God of Hammers was revealed to be Mjolnir, but by then, I was past the point of caring. The last few issues felt like a slog. I admit it. This run was mediocre at best, and it had just hit rock bottom. But then, to my shock, it picked itself up again, and rose higher than I could have ever imagined, starting off with the reveal that the reason why Mjolnir was acting like this was because it had been corrupted by Mangog when they were destroyed in the sun. This is a great explanation. Not only that, but it deals with a dumb decision from Aaron's run. Mjolnir and Mangog get destroyed by the sun because it's convenient for the plot. Mjolnir comes back good as new because it's convenient for the plot. This twist adds consequences to a previous moment that was in desperate need of them. But after picking itself up with that development, the run began to soar higher with the next issue. For context, this was back when it was stated that Gaia was not Thor's real mother. This later turned out to be a lie, but we didn't know that at the time, and Thor didn't know that. But when Thor is easily beaten by Mjolnir and it begins to destroy his friends, what does Thor do? He prays to Gaia. He prays to his mother, and she answers. The earth bends its knee to Thor as he uses his birthright from his mother to protect his friends, and then he turns around and claims his birthright from his father. Remember all of those weightless deaths I talked about? Cates seems to have taken all the weight from those deaths and put it on Odin's death. Odin apologizes to Thor, calls him the greatest thing he has ever made, reveals that he has held on to some of his power so that Freya could see him one last time, and sacrifices himself to give Thor the Odin force in full. The next issue is also great. The issue begins with a flashback of Odin teaching Thor how to use Mjolnir, and Thor is rather nervous about a planet-destroying hammer coming towards him, but Odin tells him that Mjolnir can't hurt him, and to keep his eyes open. It's a nice little moment that I thought was just supposed to give us a nice little Odin moment after his death, but the callbacks that followed were so good. I got chills seeing Mjolnir try to attack Thor, and Thor catches it and says, "You can't hurt me." Then he proceeds to completely unmake this mad hammer in a moment that is just great. Thor wakes up and sees that Mjolnir has been remade. He begins praying to his father, only for his father to speak from the hammer to Thor, and he tells him to keep his eyes open. Odin's soul now resides in Thor's hammer. That is so good. Thor's been trying to get out from under his father's shadow and rule his own way, and now he literally has his father whispering in his ear as he rules. It's such a creative concept that feels natural to the story and has a lot of potential. This story finishes with Thor number 24, which is also the 750th Thor issue. This comic functions both as an epilogue to the God of Hammer's story and as a celebration for the 750th Thor issue. In honor of Odin's funeral, Thor shows the people of Asgard several excerpts from the Book of Kings. The Book of Kings chronicles the history of Asgard, and each excerpt is a short story written by some of the most iconic Thor writers. The most exciting part for me was the return of J. Michael Straczynski, whose iconic Thor run was sadly cut short, but is still one of my favorites. Straczynski definitely delivered with an impactful story that reminded me why his run was so great. Dan Jurgens' story was a welcome trip back to a very good Thor run and gave Balder the Brave some much needed exposure. It also answered the question of why doesn't the superhero just keep the super powerful armor that they made for the big battle? Walter Simonson showed once again that his writing has not at all regressed with a very good Beta Ray Bill story, and that's easier said than done. Speaking of regressed writing, Jason Aaron's story wasn't all that good. It essentially amounts to the gods are pathetic and bad, and sentient Mjolnir is awesome and good. Al Ewing gave a decent Loki story, but I haven't read all of his work on Loki, so it didn't have as much impact for me. I think the most underrated writer in this 750th issue was Cates himself. His funeral for Odin was surprisingly well written, with Thor admitting that he and Odin had their disagreements, but also prefaces this by saying that everything that Odin did taught him how to be a better man and a better king. Cates really does a great job here of portraying Thor as doing his best to give Odin a good funeral, and yet also being very conflicted because he knows that Odin is not really dead. Really good stuff. After Cates regained my faith with these last few issues, he published another couple issues that made me feel conflicted over him again. The Banner of War storyline is a good idea. Cates is the first writer in charge of both writing Thor and Hulk in many years, and it's the 60th anniversary for both characters, so it makes sense to have an epic crossover battle. But the execution was lacking. It was off to a good start, with Thor pinning Hulk under Mjolnir and Banner using all the data on every fight they've ever had to help him push his body through Mjolnir. Then Iron Man shows up in a celestial armor and starts fighting the Hulk while Thor just watches. If this is supposed to be some big fight between Thor and Hulk, then Iron Man coming in the middle of it really throws things off. Then a super gamma bomb turns Thor into a Hulk, and Odin hammer then goes to Banner to turn him into Thor Hulk. First of all, Cates gets points off for not using the much cooler Hulk Thor design in World War Hulks. But secondly, this makes it feel even less like a fight between Thor and the Hulk. I get what Cates is trying to do. He's trying to make the most big, extreme, crazy Thor Hulk fight to end all the other Thor Hulk fights. But it turns this fight between Thor and the Hulk into a fight between a gamma monster that used to be Thor and Bruce Banner who's getting help from Odin. In the end, there isn't even a winner. Thor returns to his earlier state, and Hulk goes away. It's unfortunately a bit of a mess, and the only thing that it really accomplishes is what most of Cates' Thor stories have done: set up for the future and not really provide a satisfying ending. The two latest Cates issues, Thor number 27 and Thor number 28, are a Venom crossover, and were actually co-written by Al Ewing. Honestly, I get the impression that this was done, at least partially, because Cates has been having problems getting comics out. I haven't mentioned this before now, but there have been massive breaks in between Cates' Thor issues. They'll be monthly, and then suddenly it'll take several months for the next one to come out. He might be overworked, or he might have some personal issues going on, but clearly there's an unnatural gap between issues. November won't officially have a Thor comic, and will instead have a Thanos-focused tie-in that isn't even going to be written by Cates. The next two issues, Thor number 29 and Thor number 30, will also not be written by Cates, and instead written by Valkyrie writer Torunn Grønbekk. Back to the Venom issues. I found myself enjoying issue 28, but not enjoying issue 27 quite as much. Thor number 27 just feels kind of slow, and doesn't move the plot forward that much or provide many interesting insights. Thor number 28, on the other hand, makes much better use of its pages. It feels more interesting and action-packed. Thor number 27 introduced a symbiote-created hammer called Mjolnir. I didn't think this was a very interesting idea, but then Thor number 28 showed it had some potential. It can legitimately harm Thor and Mjolnir and Odin inside Mjolnir. Furthermore, the hammer ends up infecting a tortured Donald Blake and turns him into a true serpent. Again, I didn't love Blake as a villain, but this development may set him up to be a better villain later down the line. In order to defeat Bedlam's child, Thor and Venom fuse, creating the God in Black, a combination of the King in Black and the God who first broke the King in Black. And this combination is enough to literally put the fear of God into Bedlam's child and defeat him. This was a cool moment, as was Thor defeating Venom, who turned out to be an evil version from the future. That's one thing that Cates really does well, making Thor feel like a god. Powerful, cool, impressive, epic, whatever you want to say. He really seems to revel in writing Thor this way. He goes a bit too far in the Devourer King, as I already mentioned, but he really seems to know that Thor is a powerful character, and he's impressed with Thor, and he wants us to be impressed with Thor, and I think he does a great job with that. Well, now that I've covered all of Donny Cates' Thor run so far, I'd like to do a summary of my thoughts. And I think that I don't know what to think about Cates' Thor run. Most of it is just okay. It's not particularly good or bad. It has its highs and it has its lows, but then suddenly he'll have a spurt of a couple really good issues and then fall off again. He seems to have some big plan in the works, but he also seems to be too reliant on that plan, as he'll choose to focus on the big picture over the individual arcs. This big picture may result in an amazing story where all the pieces come together, but it also may not. It's possible that Cates is overworked, and this is causing his writing to vary in quality. He has had some really good ideas and some ideas that could have used some work. Some of the criticisms that I mentioned might be closer to nitpicks, things that bothered me personally but may not bother you. But as it stands, I don't think Cates' run will be remembered as a great Thor run. Maybe a good Thor run, but not a truly great one. But there are too many variables for me to say that he'll stay that way. He's clearly got something planned, and I don't know how this is going to turn out. Is it going to be a good run, a bad run, a mediocre run? I legitimately don't know. Cates definitely has my attention, and I really hope that he sticks the landing. Well, that's all for this episode of Thor Talk. I know it might come across as a bit of a surprise that I was kind of mixed on Cates. I really do think he could end up sticking the landing, and we'll come away from this saying, wow, that was a truly great Thor run. But I really don't think we'll know until it's all over, which is kind of exciting, honestly. So we'll see how it ends. So, with that being said, see you next time on Thor Talk, where...
You'll behold in